There is a word that has traveled further than almost any other word in the English language. It crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats. It passed through the rivers of Russia on trading routes that connected the Arctic to the Byzantine Empire. It carved itself into stone on 4 continents and left its mark on the place names of England, Ireland, Scotland, France, and the eastern coast of North America. The word is Norse. And the people it describes have been misunderstood for 1,000 years. The Vikings did not wear horned helmets. This is perhaps the most famous correction in all of popular history, and it has been repeated so many times that it has almost lost its power to surprise. But it is only the beginning of the misunderstanding. The horned helmet is the least of what has been gotten wrong. The people history calls Vikings were not a nation. They were not a unified people with a shared political identity or a common purpose. They were Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, farmers, traders, craftsmen, poets, and explorers who lived in a world shaped by long winters, thin soil, and the proximity of the sea. When the sea offered opportunity, they took it. When it offered danger, they met it. And what they built, across 3 centuries of expansion that took them from Newfoundland to Constantinople, from the Arctic to North Africa, was something that no single word quite captures. They are remembered as raiders. They were also diplomats. They are remembered as pagans who burned churches. They were also the founders of cities, the establishers of legal codes, the composers of poetry of extraordinary sophistication. They are remembered as warriors. They were also, and perhaps primarily, merchants, and the trade networks they built connected the medieval world in ways that historians are still mapping. The saga literature they left behind, written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserving oral traditions that were already centuries old, is among the most remarkable body of narrative literature in the medieval world. It contains histories, genealogies, legal arguments, love stories, ghost stories, and accounts of explorations so precise that modern archaeologists have used them as field guides. What follows is the real history of the Norse world. Not the television version. Not the museum version with the reconstructed longships. The actual one is strange, cold, brilliant, brutal, and far more human than the legend allows. Get comfortable. Let's begin. The word Viking did not mean what most people assume it means. In Old Norse, the verb Vikinger most likely referred to the act of going on an overseas expedition, a piratical or trading voyage depending on the opportunity. It was not an ethnic label or a national identity. A Norse farmer who spent his summers raiding the English coast was a Viking while he was doing it. When he came home and went back to his fields, he was a farmer again. The word described an activity, not a people. The Norse themselves used terms like Danes, Norsemen, or Northmen to describe their ethnic and regional identities. The word Viking, applied to the entire Norse cultural world of the 8th through 11th centuries, is a modern convenience accurate in the way that shorthand is accurate, which is to say imprecisely but usefully. Not a single Viking helmet with horns has ever been found in an archaeological excavation. The horned helmet is not a Viking invention. It is a 19th century Romantic invention, popularized by costume designers for Scandinavian theatrical productions and subsequently reinforced by generations of illustration, painting, and eventually film. The actual Viking helmet, in the few examples that survive, was a simple iron cap with a noseguard, functional, undecorated, and designed to protect the head in close combat rather than to intimidate at a distance. The only well-preserved Viking helmet in existence is the Jernmundbu helmet, found in a Norwegian burial mound in 1943. It is a rounded iron cap with eye and nose protection. It has no horns. It looks, to modern eyes, almost disappointingly practical. The Norse world of the Viking Age was not uniformly pagan. Christianity reached Scandinavia earlier than the popular image suggests, and the process of conversion was neither sudden nor complete. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000 AD, is credited with forcibly Christianizing Norway, compelling his subjects to convert under threat of death or mutilation. The methods were brutal and the conversions were frequently nominal. Norse farmers who accepted baptism on Sunday continued to make offerings at sacred springs and carve protective runes on their doorposts through the week. The old religion and the new coexisted, blended, and argued with each other across several generations. Many Norse graves from the conversion period contain both Christian crosses and pagan grave goods, the dead buried with one foot in each world, as if hedging against uncertainty about which one was real. The longship, the defining technological achievement of the Viking Age, was not primarily a warship. It was a remarkably versatile vessel capable of ocean crossing, river navigation, and beach landing in a single design. Its shallow draft, sometimes less than a meter, allowed it to navigate rivers too shallow for conventional ships and to be pulled directly onto beaches without a harbor. Its symmetric bow and stern allowed it to be rowed in either direction without turning, useful in confined waterways. Its clinker-built hull, overlapping planks riveted together and sealed with wool and tar, was flexible rather than rigid, allowing it to flex with wave action rather than splitting under stress. The design was the product of centuries of incremental refinement by craftsmen whose names are not recorded, working in a tradition of shipbuilding that was the most sophisticated in the medieval world. Leif Erikson reached North America approximately 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus, establishing a settlement at a place the Norse called Vinland around 1000 AD. The location of Vinland was debated for centuries, dismissed by many historians as saga mythology, until 1960, when the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lanse Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The site contained the remains of 8 buildings, iron nails, a bronze pin of Norse type, and a spindle whorl, evidence that women had been present, suggesting a settlement rather than merely an exploratory camp. The Norse had been in North America. They had built structures, lived there, and left. Why they left, whether driven out by conflict with indigenous peoples, whether the settlement proved economically unviable, whether other factors intervened, the archaeology has not fully answered. Norse women occupied a legal and social position that was, by medieval standards, remarkably autonomous. A Norse woman could own property in her own name, initiate divorce, reclaim her dowry upon divorce, and manage the household economy, which in a farming community meant managing a substantial enterprise. The sagas record women who spoke in legal assemblies, who guided their families' political decisions, and who in some cases took direct action in blood feuds when the men of their family failed to do so. The figure of the Skjoldmur, the shield maiden, a woman who fought as a warrior, appears in Norse mythology and in some saga accounts, though whether such women existed in historical reality or primarily in narrative tradition is a question that archaeology and textual scholarship continue to debate. What is not debated is that Norse women had more legal autonomy than their contemporaries in most of Europe. The Norse god Odin was not simply a warrior deity. He was the god of wisdom, poetry, death, magic, and the acquisition of knowledge through suffering. In the Norse mythological tradition, Odin hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by a spear, in order to gain the knowledge of the runes. He sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom. He traveled the world in disguise, seeking knowledge, accompanied by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew across the world each day and returned to whisper what they had seen into his ears. The god at the center of the Norse religious world was not a god of simple martial power. He was a god who paid enormous personal costs for understanding, and who remained, despite all he had sacrificed, perpetually uncertain about the future. The Norse settlement of Iceland, which began around 874 AD, was one of the most significant colonization events of the medieval period, and it happened by accident as much as by design. Iceland had no indigenous human population before Norse arrival, making it a blank canvas on which a new society could be built from scratch. The settlers brought with them not only livestock and tools but the legal and social traditions of Norway, which they adapted and formalized into a system of governance unlike anything else in the medieval world. The Althing, established around 930 AD, was a national assembly that met annually at Ingvellir, where representatives from across Iceland gathered to resolve disputes, pass laws, and conduct the business of a society that had no king and no central executive authority. It is one of the oldest functioning parliaments in the world. Iceland has been governing itself by assembly since the 10th century. The Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors, was composed primarily of Norse warriors from the late 10th century onward. Norse mercenaries had been traveling the river routes of Russia and Ukraine to reach Constantinople since the 9th century, and the reputation of Norse fighters for ferocity and, crucially, for loyalty to whoever paid them rather than to local political factions made them ideal bodyguards for emperors who trusted no one from their own court. The Varangians carried axes rather than swords and were known throughout the Byzantine world by the nickname Pelikaphoroi, the axe-bearers. Harald Hardrada, who later became King of Norway and died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard as a young man and fought in campaigns across the Byzantine Empire from Bulgaria to Asia Minor before returning north. The Norse world and the Byzantine world were connected by a thread of mercenary service that ran for centuries. Norse burial practices were extraordinarily varied and have left behind some of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. The wealthy were sometimes buried in ships, the entire vessel placed in the ground with the dead persons surrounded by their possessions, their animals, and in some cases their servants. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway in 1904, contained the remains of 2 women, a richly decorated ship, and an extraordinary collection of carved wooden objects including a cart, for sledges, and textiles of exceptional quality. The identity of the women, one elderly, one younger, and their relationship to each other has never been established. One may have been a queen. One may have been a sacrifice. The quality of the goods surrounding them indicates wealth and status of the highest order. They were buried in the early 9th century. Their names are not recorded anywhere. The Norse mythological tradition described not one apocalypse but a specific, named one, Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. In the Norse eschatological vision, the world would end in a specific sequence of events. The great wolf Fenrir would break his chains, the Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean, the fire giant Surtur would march from the south with a flaming sword, and the gods themselves would fight and die in a final battle. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would kill the Midgard serpent and then die from its venom, taking 9 steps before falling. The sun would go dark. The earth would sink into the sea. And then, in a detail that separates Norse eschatology from simple nihilism, the earth would rise again, green and renewed, and the surviving gods and humans would repopulate a cleansed world. The Norse end of the world was not merely destruction. It was a cycle. The Norse practice of blot ritual sacrifice was conducted at regular intervals throughout the year and served as the primary mechanism for maintaining the relationship between humans and gods. Sacrifices could include animals, objects of value, and in certain extraordinary circumstances, humans. The temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by the German chronicler Adam of Bremen in the 11th century, reportedly held sacrifices every 9 years at which 9 males of every species, including humans, were killed and hung in a sacred grove. Adam of Bremen was a Christian writing about pagans he had never visited, and the accuracy of his account is debated. What is not debated is that the Norse practice of sacrifice was real, that it was central to Norse religious life, and that the offerings made to the gods were understood as a form of reciprocal exchange, gifts given in expectation of gifts returned. Runes, the writing system of the Norse and Germanic peoples, were not simply an alphabet. They were understood as charged objects, each character carrying a meaning and a power beyond its phonetic value. The word rune meant secret or mystery in Old Norse. Carving runes was not writing in the modern sense, it was an act with potential magical consequences, used for curses, for protection, for marking ownership, and for commemoration of the dead. The runic inscriptions on memorial stones across Scandinavia preserve thousands of personal names and relationships from the Viking Age, providing historians with a documentary record of ordinary people that formal literary sources rarely contain. Some runestones were raised by women commemorating husbands and sons. Some were raised by merchants recording business partnerships. Some were raised for people who died in Vinland, in North America, their names carved in Swedish granite by people who had watched them sail west and never return. The Norse exploration of the North Atlantic followed a sequence of island hopping that took place over approximately a century and a half. The Faroe Islands were settled around 825 AD. Iceland was settled around 874 AD. Greenland was settled around 985 AD by Eric the Red, who had been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter and needed somewhere to go. Vinland, North America, was reached around 1000 AD. Each step extended the known world by hundreds of miles of open ocean, navigated without compass or chart, using techniques of celestial observation, wave pattern reading, bird behavior, and accumulated traditional knowledge that modern maritime scholars have spent decades attempting to reconstruct. The Norse crossed the North Atlantic in the 10th century using methods that are not fully understood, in ships that were remarkable but not invulnerable, and they did it repeatedly, routinely, as a matter of economic necessity rather than heroic adventure. The sagas, the long prose narratives of Norse literature, were written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserving oral traditions that had been maintained for generations. They are unlike any other medieval literature. They are written in a spare, declarative prose that describes violence and grief with the same flat effect as it describes the weather. Characters are introduced with genealogies that stretch back generations. Legal disputes are described with the same narrative weight as battles. Dreams are reported matter-of-factly, as if their significance is self-evident. The emotional restraint of the saga style, the way enormous tragedy is delivered in a single sentence without comment, creates a literary effect that modern readers find both alien and powerfully affecting. The Icelandic sagas are among the great literary achievements of the medieval world, written in a language that few people outside Scandinavia read, about a culture that the rest of Europe spent centuries trying to forget. The Norse settlement of Normandy, the region of northern France whose name derives from the Norse word for Northman, began in 911 AD when the Norse leader Rollo negotiated a treaty with the Frankish king Charles the Simple that gave Rollo and his followers control of the lower Seine Valley in exchange for defending it against further Norse raids. The arrangement was pragmatic on both sides. Charles could not defeat the Norse militarily and needed a buffer against future raids, while Rollo wanted land and the security of a formal territorial claim. Rollo's descendants became thoroughly French within 2 generations, adopting the French language, the Christian faith, and the feudal institutions of their new homeland. His great-great-great-grandson was William, Duke of Normandy, who invaded England in 1066 and became William the Conqueror. The Viking Age ended, in part, because the Vikings became the people they had raided. Norse cosmology described a universe of 9 worlds arranged around the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, a structure of mythological imagination so elaborate and internally consistent that scholars have spent centuries mapping its geography. Asgard, the realm of the gods. Midgard, the world of humans. Jotunheim, the realm of giants. Niflheim, the world of ice and mist. Muspelheim, the world of fire. Alfheim, the realm of the light elves. Svartalfheim, the realm of the dark elves and dwarves. Vanaheim, the realm of the Vanir gods. Helheim, the realm of the dead. Each world had its own character, its own inhabitants, and its own relationship to the others. The dead did not go to a single afterlife. Warriors who died in battle went to Valhalla or Folkvanger. Those who died of illness or old age went to hell, not a place of punishment in the Norse tradition, simply a realm of quiet shadow. The Norse city of Hedeby, located in what is now northern Germany near the Danish border, was one of the most important trading centers of the Viking Age, a cosmopolitan hub where Norse merchants traded with Franks, Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, and Byzantine Greeks. At its height in the 9th and 10th centuries, Hedeby may have had a population of several thousand, large by the standards of its era, and its archaeological remains include evidence of specialized craft production, comb-making from antler, jewelry manufacture, textile production, and glass working. Arab silver coins minted in the Islamic world have been found in its excavations alongside Frankish swords and Byzantine silk fragments. Hedeby was burned and destroyed in 1049 and never rebuilt. The site remained largely undisturbed beneath agricultural land until systematic excavation began in the 20th century. The trading city that had connected the medieval world lay in a field for 900 years. The Norse practice of seer, a form of magic associated primarily with women, was one of the most powerful and most socially ambiguous elements of Norse religious life. A Volva, a seeress who practiced seer, could travel between communities, receiving hospitality in exchange for performing rituals that revealed the future, located missing livestock or people, or influenced the outcome of coming events. The practice was taken seriously enough that the god Odin himself was said to practice it, a detail that the Norse found slightly disreputable, since seer was associated with feminine power and the crossing of gender boundaries. A man who practiced seer was urgi, a word that carried connotations of unmanliness and sexual passivity. The fact that the chief of the gods practiced a disreputable magic was not an inconsistency in Norse thought. It was a measure of how seriously they took the power of the practice. The Jelling stones, two runic memorial stones raised in the Danish royal centre of Jelling in the 10th century, represent one of the most significant historical documents of the Viking Age. The larger stone, raised by Harald Bluetooth around 965 AD, bears three faces, one with a runic inscription declaring that Harald had unified Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian, one with an image of a serpent entwined with an animal, and one with what is considered the oldest surviving image of Christ in Scandinavia. The stone is sometimes called Denmark's birth certificate, a single monument that records the unification of a nation and its conversion to Christianity simultaneously. Harald Bluetooth, whose name was borrowed by the wireless technology standard in the 1990s because its developers saw him as a unifier of communication systems, left his mark on Danish history in carved stone and on modern technology in a small blue logo. Norse traders traveled further east than most popular accounts of the Viking Age acknowledge. The Rus, Norse traders and warriors who established trading settlements along the river systems of modern Russia and Ukraine in the 9th century, navigated the Volga and Dnieper rivers to reach the Caspian and Black Seas, and from there the markets of the Islamic world and Byzantium. The name Russia itself derives from the Norse word Rus, though the precise etymology and the relationship between the Norse Rus and the Slavic peoples they encountered and eventually merged with is a subject of ongoing historical debate. Arab travelers who encountered the Rus in the 10th century left detailed descriptions of their appearance, customs, and trading practices. Ibn Fadlan's account of his encounter with a group of Rus traders on the Volga in 922 AD, including his eyewitness description of a ship funeral, is one of the most vivid and detailed descriptions of Norse people written by a contemporary outsider. The Norse legal system, the Thing, was a form of assembly-based governance that operated without a police force, a standing army, or a professional judiciary. Legal disputes were brought before the assembly, argued by the parties involved, and decided by the judgment of the assembled community. The primary punishment for serious crimes was not imprisonment or execution but outlawry, the formal exclusion of an individual from the protections of society. An outlaw could be killed by anyone without legal consequence, could not be sheltered or fed by anyone without that person incurring legal liability, and was effectively expelled from the human community. The system placed the enforcement of law on the community as a whole rather than on a specialized state apparatus. It was, in its way, a remarkably egalitarian system and a remarkably brutal one, since it transformed every member of society into a potential executioner of the law's judgments. The Norse god Loki, the trickster deity who occupies one of the most ambiguous positions in Norse mythology, was neither simply evil nor simply comic. He was the agent of change in a cosmos that valued stability, the disruptor of divine order, and the ultimate cause of Ragnarok. He was also the problem solver who repeatedly used his cunning to rescue the gods from difficulties they could not resolve by force. He was the mother of Odin's eight-legged horse Sleipnir, having transformed himself into a mare to distract a giant stallion. He was the father of Fenrir, the Midgard serpent, and Hel, the three beings who would bring about the world's end. He was chained beneath the earth after engineering the death of the god Balder, and the earthquakes were said to be caused by his writhing. Loki is one of the most psychologically complex figures in world mythology, a character who was simultaneously essential and destructive, beloved and feared, the gods' greatest asset and their ultimate doom. The Norse colonization of Greenland, which began around 985 AD and lasted for approximately 5 centuries, represents one of the most haunting disappearances in medieval history. At its height, the Greenlandic Norse population may have numbered around 5,000 people, living in 2 main settlement areas on the island's southwestern coast, farming, hunting, and trading walrus ivory to European markets. Then, sometime in the 15th century, they vanished. The eastern settlement was abandoned around 1400 AD. The western settlement had already been empty for decades before that. No definitive explanation has been established. Climate cooling, the collapse of the ivory trade when elephant ivory became more available, conflict with the Inuit peoples who were expanding southward, plague, or simply the economic unviability of maintaining a European community at the edge of the habitable world, all have been proposed. The last records of the Greenlandic Norse are a marriage register from 1408. After that, silence. Norse poetry, skaldic verse, was one of the most technically demanding literary forms in the medieval world. A trained skald was expected to compose in meters so intricate that a single stanza could contain multiple overlapping formal constraints, a fixed number of syllables per line, a specific pattern of alliteration, an internal rhyme scheme, and a structural requirement for kennings, elaborate compound metaphors in which a sword might be called the wound snake or the sea might be called the whale road. The kenning tradition produced a vocabulary of indirect reference so extensive that scholars have compiled dictionaries of it. The most accomplished skalds could compose in the most complex meters, Drottfate, the court meter, in real time, producing praise poetry for their patrons on demand. The poems were memorized and performed, transmitted orally across generations. When the sagas were written down in Iceland, the skaldic verses embedded in them were treated as historical evidence. Their formal difficulty made them almost impossible to alter without detection, making them among the most reliable verbal documents of the Viking Age. The Norse raids on the monasteries of Ireland, Scotland, and England, beginning with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, were not random acts of destruction. They were targeted economic operations against known concentrations of wealth. Christian monasteries were, in the early medieval period, among the richest institutions in Northern Europe. They held gold and silver liturgical objects, fine textiles, illuminated manuscripts with jeweled bindings, and accumulated donations from centuries of noble patronage. They were also frequently located on islands or coastal promontories easily accessible by sea and poorly defended. The Norse raiders who struck Lindisfarne were not attacking Christianity as a religion. They were attacking a warehouse. The outrage expressed by Christian chroniclers at the desecration of sacred sites reflects genuine horror, but it also reflects the chroniclers' inability to understand an economic calculus that was entirely rational from the Norse perspective. The Eddic poems, a body of Old Norse mythological and heroic poetry preserved primarily in a single manuscript, the Codex Regius, discovered in Iceland in 1643, represent the most complete surviving record of pre-Christian Norse religious and mythological thought. The manuscript was written down in the 13th century but preserves material that is considerably older. How much older is disputed, with estimates ranging from a few centuries to a millennium. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, which opens the collection, is one of the most extraordinary religious poems in world literature, a creation narrative, a catalogue of the gods and their fates, and a vision of Ragnarok and the world's renewal, all delivered in the voice of a dead Volva speaking from beyond death at Odin's request. It was composed by someone whose name is not recorded, in a language that died as a living tongue centuries ago, and it describes a universe that no one has believed in for 1,000 years. It remains, in translation, deeply moving. The Norse settlement of Dublin, one of the most important cities in medieval Ireland, was established around 841 AD as a longfort, a fortified harbour from which Norse traders and raiders could operate. It grew rapidly into a significant trading centre and remained under Norse control, with interruptions, until the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. The Norse of Dublin traded slaves, furs, and silver across a network that connected Ireland to Iceland, Norway, and the markets of continental Europe and the Islamic world. The city they built lies beneath modern Dublin, and archaeological excavations at Woodquay in the 1970s and 1980s revealed extraordinary preserved remains of Norse urban life, timber buildings, leather shoes, wooden combs, gaming pieces, and the debris of daily existence preserved in the waterlogged soil for 11 centuries. The excavations became one of the most significant and most contested archaeological projects in Irish history. The Norse concept of Wyrd fate was not identical to the concept of predestination. The Norns, the three female beings who wove the threads of fate at the foot of Yggdrasil, determined the destiny of every being, including the gods. But Norse fate was not a divine plan with moral purpose. It was simply what would happen. A man could know his fate, could be told by a seeress how and when he would die, and could still choose how to meet it. The Norse heroic ideal was not to escape fate but to face it without flinching. The sagas are full of characters who know they are going to die and proceed anyway, not from ignorance but from a code of honor that valued the manner of dying over the fact of survival. This acceptance of the inevitable, combined with a fierce insistence on personal dignity in the face of it, gives Norse literature a quality of stoicism that reads, across 10 centuries, as unexpectedly modern. The conversion of Iceland to Christianity in the year 1000 AD was accomplished not by conquest or coercion but by a legal decision made at the Althing, the National Assembly. The society had been divided between Christian and pagan factions, and the conflict threatened to tear the legal framework of the community apart. The assembly appointed a single individual, the lawspeaker or Jarlisvetningnagoi, to decide the question for the entire community. Orger withdrew to his booth, lay down under his cloak, and remained there in silence for a full day and night. When he emerged, he announced that Iceland would become Christian and that the old religious practices could continue in private. The decision preserved social unity at the cost of religious uniformity. It was a political solution to a theological problem, made by a pagan lawspeaker who announced it, took the pagan idols from his farm, and threw them into a waterfall. The waterfall is still there. It is called Gofoss, the waterfall of the gods. The Norse traders who traveled the eastern river routes carried with them enormous quantities of Arabic silver, dirhams minted in the Islamic world that reached Scandinavia through the Volga trade routes in quantities that still astonish archaeologists. Hoards of Arabic coins have been found across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Ireland in numbers that indicate the scale of the silver trade was extraordinary. The largest known Viking Age silver hoard found on the Swedish island of Gotland contained over 67 kilograms of silver, including coins, ingots, and jewelry. Gotland alone has yielded more than 700 separate silver hoards from the Viking Age. The island sat at the center of the Baltic trade network and accumulated silver from both east and west. The Norse economic world was not a raiding economy. It was a trading economy that raided when trade was unavailable or insufficiently profitable. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on September 25, 1066, 3 weeks before the more famous Battle of Hastings, marked the effective end of the Viking Age in England. The Norwegian king Harald Hardrada invaded northern England with a fleet of approximately 300 ships and was met by the English king Harold Godwin's son, who had marched his army the length of England in 4 days. The Norse army, caught unprepared on the far side of the Stamford Bridge, was routed. Harald Hardrada, described by his contemporaries as the last great Viking king, was killed by an arrow in the throat. The Norse fleet that had arrived with 300 ships left with 24, carrying the survivors. Harold Godwin's son then turned his exhausted army south to face William of Normandy at Hastings, where he was defeated and killed. England was conquered twice in 3 weeks, once by a Viking, and once by the descendant of Vikings. Norse navigation across the open ocean relied on a combination of observational techniques that modern researchers have worked for decades to fully understand. Star navigation, using the North Star and the positions of other stars at different times of year to determine latitude, was fundamental. Solar navigation using a bearing dial allowed the direction of the sun to be tracked even in cloudy conditions by measuring its arc. The sunstone, a legendary navigational instrument mentioned in Norse sources, may have been a crystal of Iceland spar, a form of calcite that polarizes light and can indicate the direction of the sun through cloud cover. Experiments with Iceland spar crystals have confirmed that they can determine solar direction with sufficient accuracy for oceanic navigation. The Norse also read the sea itself, the behavior of waves, the color of water, the presence of ice and its associated currents, the behavior of seabirds, and the smell of land. Navigation was not a single technique. It was a discipline that integrated dozens of sources of information simultaneously. The Norse occupied York, which they called Jorvik, from 866 AD until 954 AD, transforming it into one of the most prosperous trading cities in northern Europe. At its height, Jorvik may have had a population of 10,000 people, large for the period, engaged in trade, craft production, and the commerce of a city that sat at the intersection of Norse, Anglo-Saxon, and continental European trade networks. The Coppergate excavations in York, conducted between 1976 and 1981, revealed extraordinary preservation of Norse-era organic material in the waterlogged soil, wooden buildings, leather shoes, textiles, foodstuffs, and the remains of daily life preserved for 1,000 years in conditions that normally destroy organic material within decades. The excavations also revealed, in remarkable detail, what the Norse ate, what they wore, what parasites they carried, and how their city was organized. Jorvik is now a museum. The smell of the reconstructed Norse city, which the museum recreates using scent, is reportedly unforgettable. The Norse god Thor, the most popular deity in the Norse pantheon, to judge from the frequency of his name and Norse personal names and place names, was not simply a warrior. He was the protector of humanity, the god who stood between the ordered world of Midgard and the giants who perpetually threatened to overwhelm it. His hammer Mjolnir was the weapon with which he defended the cosmic order, and miniature hammer amulets worn as protective jewelry are among the most commonly found objects in Viking Age archaeological contexts. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, the hammer amulet and the Christian cross existed side by side for generations, sometimes combined in a single object, a pendant that could be read as either a hammer or a cross depending on the viewer's perspective. The craftsmen who made these ambiguous objects understood their market. The people who wore them understood their world. The Norse practice of carving runes on objects to activate their properties was not limited to spectacular monuments. Runes were carved on everyday objects, combs, spindles, knife handles, drinking horns, as protective or activating inscriptions. Some inscriptions were straightforward ownership marks. Others were healing formulas. Others were curses. A runic inscription found on a piece of wood from Bergen, Norway, dating from the medieval period, reads in its entirety as an explicit erotic solicitation. The person who carved it presumably expected it to produce a specific magical result. The runes were tools, applied to every purpose that tools can serve, from the sublime to the entirely mundane. The gap between the cosmic seriousness of Norse mythology and the practical earthiness of Norse daily life was smaller than the mythology alone suggests. The Norse age of settlement in Iceland, the Landnam, roughly 874 to 930 AD, is documented in a remarkable text called the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which records the names, origins, and land claims of approximately 400 original settlers and their families. The book was compiled from oral traditions in the 12th century and provides a level of genealogical and geographical detail unprecedented in medieval historical sources. It records not only who settled where but the legal disputes, family relationships, and memorable events associated with each farm. The settlers came primarily from Norway, many of them fleeing the consolidation of royal power under Harold Fairhair, but also from Ireland, Scotland, and the Norse communities of the British Isles, bringing Celtic slaves and wives whose genetic contribution to the Icelandic population has been confirmed by modern DNA analysis. Iceland was settled by a Norse Celtic population, and it has remembered its origins with extraordinary precision for 1100 years. The Norse raids on Paris, the first of which occurred in 845 AD when a fleet led by a Norse chieftain known as Ragnar sacked the city and was paid £7,000 of silver to leave, represented both a military and an economic strategy. The Frankish kingdom was wealthy, fragmented by internal political conflict, and poorly defended along its river approaches. The Seine gave Norse longships direct access to the heart of France. Paris was raided multiple times across the following decades, besieged famously in 885 to 886 AD by a force that may have numbered in the hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of warriors. The city held, defended by a small garrison under the Count Odo, while the Frankish king Charles the Fat negotiated with the Norse rather than relieving the siege. Charles's failure to relieve Paris damaged his authority fatally and contributed to his deposition the following year. The Norse did not take Paris. They took everything else they wanted and left. The Vinland map, a document that surfaced in the 1950s purporting to be a 15th century map showing Norse knowledge of North America, was subjected to decades of analysis before being definitively identified as a 20th century forgery in the 1970s. The ink used in the map contained a chemical compound, anatase titanium dioxide, that was not manufactured until the 20th century. The map had been presented as evidence that Norse knowledge of North America predated Columbus's voyage, and its exposure as a forgery was a significant moment in the history of Viking scholarship. The irony is that the genuine archaeological evidence for Norse presence in North America, the Lance aux Meadows site, is entirely sufficient to establish Norse priority without the map. The forgery was unnecessary. The history it tried to prove was already true. Norse women sometimes accompanied their husbands on trading and raiding voyages, and the spindle whorl found at Lance aux Meadows is the most tangible evidence that women were present in the Norse settlement of North America. The sagas confirm this. The saga of the Greenlanders records that a woman named Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, participated in the Vinland voyages and, in one account, faced down a group of indigenous warriors while pregnant, striking her own chest with a sword to intimidate them into retreat. Whether this specific incident is historical or legendary is uncertain. What is clear is that the Norse conception of the Vinland expeditions included women as participants, not merely as people left behind. The frontier of the Norse world, at its furthest extent, was not exclusively male. The Norse word berserker, now used in English to mean someone acting with uncontrolled fury, referred in the original Norse context to a specific type of warrior who entered a battle state of extreme aggression and apparent insensitivity to pain. Norse sagas describe berserkers howling like animals, biting their shields, and fighting with a ferocity that seemed to make them immune to wounds that would stop ordinary warriors. The mechanism by which this state was achieved is debated. Some historians have proposed that certain fungi or plant preparations may have been involved, while others suggest that the berserker state was a form of trained psychological conditioning, a ritual preparation for battle that released extreme aggression on command. What is clear is that berserkers were real. They appear in historical sources as well as sagas, are mentioned in legal codes that regulated their behavior, and were apparently feared and valued in roughly equal measure. The Norse exploration of the North Atlantic was made possible in part by the medieval warm period, a climatic anomaly from approximately 900 to 1300 AD during which temperatures in the North Atlantic were somewhat warmer than in preceding or following centuries. The warmer conditions made the sea routes to Iceland, Greenland, and North America more accessible. Less ice, shorter seasons of dangerous weather, more reliable passage windows. When the climate began to cool in the 14th century, a shift associated with the beginning of the Little Ice Age, the Greenlandic settlements became increasingly isolated, the sea routes increasingly dangerous, and the marginal agriculture of the Norse Greenlandic farms increasingly unviable. The Norse expansion into the North Atlantic was, in part, a climatic opportunity. Its contraction was, in part, a climatic consequence. The people who thrived in one climate and struggled in another left no account of understanding why their world was changing. The Norse had a specific concept for the peculiar melancholy of a person who has outlived their time, a warrior who has survived all the battles that gave life meaning and now exists in a world that no longer requires what he knows how to do. The word was gammal in its common sense, simply old, but the sagas expressed the condition in narrative terms, the old warrior sitting by the fire while younger men do the fighting, knowing that his strength is gone and that the world that shaped him is passing. This figure appears repeatedly in the sagas, and the tone in which his condition is described is one of the most affecting registers in Norse literature, neither sentimental nor dismissive, simply observant. The Norse world had a place in its literature for the specific grief of obsolescence, of surviving into a time that does not need you. The sagas treated this grief with the same careful attention they gave to battle and law. Norse ships were not merely functional. They were objects of aesthetic intention, crafted with a level of decorative care that suggests their makers understood them as expressions of identity and status. The prows of Norse ships were carved with dragon and serpent heads, a fact recorded in chronicles written by people who encountered Norse fleets and were struck by the visual impact of those carved heads approaching across the water. The serpent head prows were, according to Norse law, required to be removed when a ship entered a home harbor, to avoid frightening the land spirits. The same ships that carried warriors across the North Sea with the explicit intention of frightening people were required, by law, to be gentle with the spiritual inhabitants of their own coastlines. The Norse relationship with the supernatural was not merely fearful. It was courteous. Fact 45. The Norse goddess Freya was one of the most complex and powerful deities in the Norse pantheon, a goddess of love, fertility, magic, and death who received half of all warriors slain in battle. She was the primary practitioner of seer magic. She owned a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed its wearer to transform into a bird. She possessed a necklace, the Brisingamen, of extraordinary beauty that she had obtained from 4 dwarves in circumstances that the sources describe with notable ambiguity. She wept tears of gold for her husband Ar, who had disappeared under unclear circumstances. She is simultaneously the most overtly sexual and the most magically powerful figure in the Norse divine world, a combination that the sources treat not as contradictory but as aspects of the same fundamental force. Her name survives in the English word Friday, Freya's Day, making her one of the few pre-Christian European deities still commemorated in the daily language of the modern world. The Norse longhouse, the primary architectural form of the Viking Age, was not simply a dwelling. It was a social institution. A large longhouse could be 40 meters long, housing the extended family, their animals, their grain stores, and their guests under a single roof. The central fire ran the length of the building, providing heat and light and a cooking surface. The animals wintered at one end, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the structure. Guests slept along the walls on benches that were also used as work surfaces during the day. The longhouse was a complete environment: work, sleep, cooking, socializing, and the care of animals all happening in a single space under a smoke-filled roof. The intimacy it imposed on its inhabitants was total. The Norse world was not a world of privacy. It was a world lived collectively, in the warmth of shared bodies and shared fire, through the long northern winters. The Norse tradition of a specific form of social shame associated with cowardice, dishonor, and sexual passivity, was so serious that the verbal expression of it could legally justify violence. To call a man ningr, a term that combined connotations of cowardice and sexual disgrace, was a formal insult with legal consequences. Norse law in Iceland listed an as one of the few insults that entitled the person insulted to kill the person who had uttered it without legal penalty. The severity of the legal response reflects the severity of the social wound. Honor in the Norse world was not merely a personal matter. It was a social resource, accumulated and defended across a lifetime, inherited from ancestors and bequeathed to descendants. To attack a man's honor was to attack not just him but his entire lineage, forward and backward in time. The legal system recognized this, and calibrated its responses accordingly. The Norse settlement of the Orkney and Shetland Islands, which began in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, transformed these archipelagos from Celtic-speaking communities into Norse-speaking ones so completely that the indigenous Celtic languages disappeared within a few generations. The place names of Orkney and Shetland are almost entirely Norse in origin, a linguistic stratigraphy that records the replacement of one culture by another in the toponymic record. A form of Norse, Norn, was spoken in the islands until the 18th century, when it finally gave way to Scots English. The last recorded speaker of Norn died in the 18th century, taking the last living thread of that particular Norse dialect with them. The language is gone. The place names remain, pronounced now by people who do not know what they mean, carrying Norse sounds across a landscape that Norse settlers named 1,000 years ago. The Prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar and politician Snorri Sturluson around 1220 AD, is the most comprehensive single source for Norse mythology. Snorri was a Christian writing about a pagan tradition he had received through oral and literary inheritance, and his relationship to his material is complex. He clearly found it fascinating, he reproduced it with evident care, and he simultaneously framed it in ways that made it acceptable to a Christian audience by suggesting that the Norse gods were not supernatural beings but ancient human kings who had been deified by their followers. Whether Snorri believed this euhemeristic interpretation himself, or whether he used it as protective framing for material he valued on its own terms, is a question that Snorri scholarship has never definitively resolved. What is certain is that without Snorri, the Norse mythological tradition would be fragmentary and largely incomprehensible. He saved it. He also, in saving it, shaped it. The Norse world at the height of the Viking Age was connected to the Islamic world through a silver trade of extraordinary scale. Arab merchants traveling from the Caspian Sea region northward, and Norse merchants traveling south along the Volga, met in trading centers where silver dirhams were exchanged for furs, slaves, amber, and walrus ivory. The flow of Islamic silver northward into Scandinavia during the 9th and 10th centuries was so large that it influenced the monetary systems of northern Europe. When the silver flow slowed in the early 11th century as the Islamic world's silver mines became depleted and political instability disrupted the eastern trade routes, the economic consequences were felt across the Norse world. The reduction in silver may have been one of the economic factors that contributed to the end of the Viking Age. The Norse expansion had been partly fueled by the economics of a silver trade that connected the fjords of Norway to the markets of Baghdad. The Norse funeral described by Ibn Fadlan on the Volga in 922 AD, in which a chief was cremated in his ship along with a slave woman who had volunteered to accompany him in death, is one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of Viking Age ritual practice. Ibn Fadlan describes the 10 days of preparation, the rituals performed over the body, the intoxicating drink consumed by the slave woman as she was passed from tent to tent among the chief's companions, and finally the burning of the ship. He describes the Norsemen who accompanied him on his journey as the most perfectly built people he had ever seen, and the most filthy, washing their hands and faces collectively in a single basin of water that each man used after the last, a practice that Ibn Fadlan, accustomed to running water and individual ablution, found disgusting. His account crosses cultural boundaries in both directions. He found the Norse fascinating and appalling, and the Norse, through his recording of their customs, have found readers for 11 centuries. The Norse mythological tradition contained a specific eschatological warning known as Fimbulvetur, the Great Winter, that would precede Ragnarok. The Fimbulvetur was described as 3 consecutive winters without intervening summers, a period of cold and darkness and social breakdown during which the bonds of civilization would dissolve, brother killing brother, parents and children turning against each other. Some researchers have connected the Fimbulvetur legend to the climatic event of 536 AD, when a catastrophic volcanic eruption, now believed to be one of the largest in the last 2,000 years, ejected enough ash and sulfur into the atmosphere to reduce global temperatures for several years, causing crop failures and social upheaval across the northern hemisphere. The event occurred approximately 3 centuries before the Viking Age, but its memory may have entered Norse mythological tradition as the template for the cosmic winter that precedes the end of the world. The Norse colonization of the British Isles left behind a linguistic deposit that is still visible in the everyday English vocabulary. Words of Norse origin in modern English include sky, window, husband, knife, egg, law, wrong, ugly, awkward, scant, loose, flat, rugged, take, call, want, get, give, and hundreds of others. The Norse contribution to English vocabulary was not confined to specialized domains but penetrated the most basic levels of everyday speech. This depth of influence reflects the intimacy of Norse Anglo-Saxon contact, not merely the contact of raiders and victims, but the contact of communities that lived side by side in the Danelaw for generations, intermarried, traded, argued, and gradually merged their vocabularies. The English language carries Norse in its bones, in the words used for sky and window and the simple act of wanting something. The Norse exploration of the North Atlantic took place in vessels that, by modern standards, would be considered extraordinarily small for open ocean crossings. A typical Norse ocean-going vessel, Anar, the cargo ship used for Atlantic crossings, was approximately 16 meters long and 5 meters wide, with a draft of about 1.2 meters. It had a single square sail and could be rowed in calm conditions. It had no deck. Cargo and passengers were exposed to the open sky, protected only by sleeping bags made from animal hide and by the experience of reading the weather before it arrived. Experimental reconstructions of Norse vessels have successfully crossed the North Atlantic, confirming that the design was capable of the voyages the sagas describe. The people who made the original crossings did so in these small wooden boats, in North Atlantic weather, with no margin for error and no rescue if things went wrong. They did it anyway. The Norse practice of holmgang, ritualized single combat on a small island or marked-off area, was the Viking Age equivalent of trial by combat, used to resolve disputes that could not be settled by legal argument. The rules were precise. The combat took place on a height of specified dimensions, weapons, and the number of shield bearers were regulated, and the outcome was legally binding. A man who won a holmgang won his legal case. A man who refused a holmgang challenge lost his honor and potentially his legal standing. Professional holmgangsmen, men who issued holmgang challenges as a form of extortion, fighting and winning repeatedly to accumulate wealth from their defeated opponents, appear in the sagas as figures of particular social menace. The practice was eventually outlawed in Iceland in 1006 AD, having been recognized as a mechanism by which physically powerful men could override the legal system entirely. The Norse world's most northerly documented settlement was at Kingigtorsok in Greenland, where 4 runestones were found in 1824, inscribed with a date corresponding to 1333 AD. 3 Norsemen had reached approximately 73 degrees north latitude, far above the Arctic Circle, on what appears to have been a hunting or exploratory expedition. They carved their names and the date and erected the stones. Why they were there, whether they returned, and what became of them is not recorded. The stones are the northernmost Norse inscription ever found. They stand as evidence that even in the 14th century, as the Greenlandic settlements were failing, Norse hunters were pushing further north than anyone had gone before, into landscapes of ice and polar night, looking for whatever was still worth finding. The Volsunga saga, the Norse heroic saga that tells the story of the dragonslayer Sigurd and the cursed gold of the Nibelungs, is the source material from which Richard Wagner composed his 4 operas Cycle der Ring de Nibelungen in the 19th century. The saga's themes, the cursed treasure that destroys everyone who possesses it, the hero who is betrayed by those closest to him, the woman who chooses death over dishonor, were old in Norse tradition when they were written down in Iceland, and may preserve Germanic heroic traditions that date to the migration period of the 5th and 6th centuries. The Norse mythological and heroic tradition fed, through a long chain of literary transmission, into the cultural productions of the modern world, Wagner's operas, Tolkien's Middle-earth, the entire genre of high fantasy literature. The shadow cast by the Norse imagination across the last 12 centuries of Western culture is long and rarely fully acknowledged. The Norse world ended not with a dramatic military defeat but with a gradual cultural transformation. The conversion to Christianity, which was complete in Scandinavia by the 12th century, did not destroy the Norse tradition, it preserved it, by creating a literate class with the tools and the interest to write it down. The Icelandic scholars who compiled the sagas, the Eddas, and the law codes of the Norse world were Christians, working in a Christian intellectual tradition, recording a pagan world that they found fascinating precisely because it was no longer threatening. The Norse mythology survived because Christians saved it. The irony is characteristic of how cultures actually work. The victorious tradition preserves the defeated one, transformed and domesticated and safely passed, and in doing so ensures its survival in a form that its original practitioners would not entirely recognize. The Norse thing, the legal assembly, met at sites that were understood to be neutral ground, often at natural features that had long served as gathering points. The Ingvellir in Iceland, where the Althing met annually, sits in a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, its landscape shaped by the same geological forces that created Iceland. The Norse chose this site not for its geological significance, they did not know about tectonic plates, but for its practical qualities. It was roughly central, it had good grazing for the horses of the assembled delegates, and the acoustics of the Rift Valley walls allowed a speaker to be heard by large numbers of people. Laws were recited aloud here every year for centuries. The law speaker, the official responsible for memorizing and reciting the entire body of Icelandic law, stood at the law rock and spoke the law into the valley. The laws existed in a human voice before they existed on paper. For 2 centuries, the entire legal code of Iceland lived in one person's memory. The Norse ship burial tradition reached its most elaborate form in the 9th century and then declined relatively quickly. The Osberg burial of approximately 834 AD and the Gokstad burial of approximately 900 AD represent the peak of the tradition, after which Christian burial practices, which required the body to be preserved for resurrection and therefore discouraged the destruction of goods in a funeral fire, began to replace the older customs. The transition from ship burial to Christian interment was not instantaneous. Graves from the conversion period show a negotiation between the two traditions, bodies oriented in the Christian east-west direction but still furnished with grave goods, or bodies in coffins but with a sword placed alongside. The dead of the transition period were buried by people who were not sure which world their relatives would wake up in, and who hedged accordingly. The Norse kenning for the sea Valveg, the whale road, appears in the opening lines of the Old English poem Beowulf, which is not a Norse poem but an Anglo-Saxon one, composed in a language shaped by centuries of Norse contact and influence. Beowulf's world, its mead halls, its gift-giving kings, its monsters from the dark water, its elegiac tone of doom and transience, reflects a Germanic heroic culture that the Norse and the Anglo-Saxons shared before they became distinct peoples. The poem describes a Danish king and a Swedish hero in a world of sea crossings and night terrors that sits at the intersection of Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultural memory. It was written down in Christian England by a Christian scribe, preserving a pagan world with the same ambivalent care that Snorri Sturluson would bring to the Norse myths 3 centuries later. The literature of the Norse world and the literature of Anglo-Saxon England look at each other across a narrow sea and recognize the same faces. The Norse calendar divided the year into 2 seasons, winter and summer, rather than 4, a division that reflects the agricultural and climatic reality of Scandinavian life more accurately than the 4-season system of Mediterranean origin. Winter began in mid-October, at a feast called Veturnatur, the winter nights, when sacrifices were made to the gods and the dead, and the livestock that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered. Summer began in mid-April, when the sea routes reopened and the year's expeditions, trading, raiding, exploring, became possible. The Norse experienced time not as a continuous flow but as an alternation between 2 fundamentally different states of existence, the contraction and darkness of winter, and the expansion and light of summer. The year was a binary rhythm, and the Norse life organized itself around its pulse. The Norse god Balder, described in the mythology as the most beautiful, the most beloved, and the most doomed of the gods, died from a mistletoe dart thrown by his blind brother Hr, guided by Loki's malicious instruction. The death of Balder was the first of the events that would lead to Ragnarok, and the Norse mythological tradition treats it with a gravity appropriate to its cosmological significance. Every being in the world had sworn not to harm Balder, every being except mistletoe, which Frigg had overlooked because it seemed too young and small to be dangerous. The oversight, the single exception to a universal protection, is the mechanism of Balder's death and, eventually, the world's end. The Norse imagination found the catastrophic consequence lurking in the smallest exception, in the thing too insignificant to be worth worrying about. The end of the world entered through a plant. The Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England under Norse political and legal control from the late 9th century onward, was not simply a military occupation. It was a cultural zone in which Norse and Anglo-Saxon law, language, and custom coexisted and merged over generations. The boundary of the Danelaw, established by treaty between Alfred the Great and the Norse leader Guthrum in 886 AD, divided England along a line running roughly from London to Chester. North and east of the line, Norse custom prevailed. South and west, Anglo-Saxon law governed. In practice, the boundary was permeable. Norse settlers and Anglo-Saxon farmers lived as neighbors, intermarried, borrowed each other's words and legal concepts, and produced a mixed culture that neither side could have predicted and neither side entirely controlled. The England that emerged from the Danelaw was neither Norse nor Anglo-Saxon. It was the beginning of something new. The Norse practice of fostering, sending children to be raised in another household, was a mechanism for building political alliances and social bonds across communities. A child sent to be fostered in a powerful household gained access to education, connections, and status, while the family that sent the child gained a political relationship with the receiving household. The foster-parent relationship in Norse society was often described as more emotionally intense than the biological parent relationship. The sagas frequently portray foster fathers and foster sons with a depth of mutual loyalty that exceeds the bond between biological fathers and sons. The system created networks of obligation that ran across Norse society, binding families together through children who grew up in borrowed households, owing loyalty to people who were not their parents, and carrying those loyalties for the rest of their lives. The Norse rune Hagalaz, representing hail, was one of the most feared of the runic characters, associated with sudden destructive force that fell from the sky without warning and destroyed what it struck without distinction. The Norse relationship with weather was not merely practical. It was cosmological. Weather was a manifestation of forces in the nine worlds, a seepage of Jotunheim's chaos into Midgard's order. The farmer who lost his crops to hail experienced not just an agricultural disaster but a cosmological one, a failure of the boundary between order and chaos. This understanding of weather as meaningful, as a communication from the forces that shaped the world, gave the Norse a framework for interpreting catastrophe that was neither passive nor despairing. Hail fell. The world was not safe. It had never been safe. You built what you could while the weather permitted, and you prepared as best you could for when it did not. The last recorded Norse raid on England took place in 1153, nearly 4 centuries after the first raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD. By 1153, the Norse world that had conducted those raids was almost unrecognizable from its 9th century form. Scandinavia was Christian, feudalized, and organized into recognizable kingdoms. The longships still existed, but they sailed on different errands. The raiders had become crusaders, merchants, and subjects of consolidated monarchies. The Viking Age, if it can be said to have ended at a specific moment, ended not with a battle or a treaty but with the gradual transformation of the societies that had produced it into something that no longer needed what raiding had provided. The violence did not stop. It simply changed its forms, its justifications, and its destinations. The Norse mythological tradition described the creation of the world from the body of a giant. In the beginning, there was only Ginnungagap, the great void between Niflheim, the world of ice, and Muspelheim, the world of fire. Where they met, the ice melted, and from the melt a giant named Ymir was formed, and a cow named Aumbla, who licked the salt ice and revealed a man named Buri, whose grandson Odin killed Ymir and made the world from his corpse, the earth from his flesh, the sea from his blood, the sky from his skull, the clouds from his brains, the mountains from his bones. The Norse did not believe the world was created for human benefit or as an expression of divine love. They believed it was made from a corpse, from the raw material of a being that had been killed to provide the substance of existence. The world, in the Norse view, was built on violence. It would end in violence. The interval in between was what you had. The Norse term draugr, usually translated as ghost or undead, referred specifically to a dead person who had returned to their burial mound and refused to stay in it. The draugr was not a spirit but a corporeal revenant still in possession of its body, physically present, and dangerous. It could grow in size, could not be killed by ordinary means, and had to be physically wrestled outside the burial mound, decapitated, and burned. The sagas describe specific encounters with specific draugr, named individuals whose posthumous behavior was a continuation of their living characters. A miser in life became a draugr that hoarded and guarded his burial goods. A violent man in life became a violent revenant. The Norse dead were not simply absent. They were present still in the landscape, still capable of action, still requiring management. The relationship between the living and the dead was not severed by death. It was merely complicated. The Norse world's literary tradition was not confined to Iceland. Norse poetry and saga literature was composed and performed across the Norse cultural sphere in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, the British Isles, Greenland, and wherever Norse communities established themselves. But Iceland became its primary archive, for reasons of geography and political circumstance. Iceland's isolation from the conflicts that swept continental Scandinavia during the conversion period allowed its literary tradition to develop without the interruptions that attended political upheaval elsewhere. Iceland's legal culture, with its emphasis on verbal precision and the memorization of complex oral texts, created an environment in which narrative and poetic tradition was valued and preserved. When the sagas were written down, they were written down in Iceland, by Icelanders, about a Norse world that extended far beyond Iceland's shores but that Iceland alone had preserved in sufficient detail to reconstruct. The Norse practice of human sacrifice, while attested in literary and some archaeological sources, has been subject to significant scholarly debate regarding its scale and regularity. The sources that describe it most vividly: Adam of Bremen's account of the Uppsala temple, saga references to the sacrifice of kings in times of famine, are either written by outsiders with evident anti-pagan bias or are literary texts whose historical accuracy is uncertain. The archaeological evidence is more cautious. Some burial sites contain remains that may indicate sacrificial killing, but the interpretation of such evidence is rarely unambiguous. What the evidence does support is that the Norse, like most ancient cultures, practiced sacrifice in some form, that offerings to the gods included, in extraordinary circumstances, human offerings, and that these practices were understood as entirely legitimate within the Norse religious framework. The extraordinary circumstances, famine, plague, the loss of war, were precisely the moments when the most extreme measures seemed most necessary. The Norse settlement pattern in England, Scotland, and Ireland left behind a permanent mark in the landscape that is still legible today in place names. The Norse suffix by meaning farm or settlement survives in hundreds of English place names: Whitby, Derby, Rugby, Grimsby, Selby, Kirkby. The suffix thorpe meaning secondary settlement or hamlet appears in Scunthorpe, Cleatharps, Mablethorpe. The suffix thwaite meaning a clearing in woodland appears in Braithwaite, Applethwaite, Satterthwaite. The suffix toft meaning a homestead appears in Lowestoft, Langtoft, Nortoft. To drive through the English Midlands or the north of England is to drive through a landscape named in Norse, by people who are gone, whose language is dead, whose religion has been replaced, whose ships have long since rotted into the harbor mud. The names remain, pronounced by people who do not know they are speaking Norse. The Norse world's relationship with silk, one of the most luxurious and expensive commodities of the medieval period, was more intimate than the popular image of rough northern warriors suggests. Silk garments and silk fragments have been found in high-status Norse burials across Scandinavia, brought from Byzantium and the Islamic world through the eastern trade routes. Norse chieftains dressed in silk when the occasion demanded it. The contrast between the iron and leather reality of Norse maritime life and the silkangold of a Norse chieftain's hall reflects the broader contrast that runs through the Norse world, the roughness and practicality of the daily working life, and the deliberate, carefully maintained luxury of the ceremonial one. The Norse understood display. They understood that the visible accumulation of fine things communicated power, and they invested in that communication with the same seriousness they invested in their ships and their weapons. The Battle of Clontarf, fought on Good Friday, April 23, 1014 AD, outside Dublin, was one of the defining events of Irish history and is traditionally regarded as the battle that ended Norse power in Ireland. The Irish High King Brian Boru, aged, by some accounts, in his 70s, defeated a coalition of Norse and Irish enemies on the shores of Dublin Bay. He was killed in his tent by a fleeing Norse warrior after the battle had been won, a death the sagas describe with the specific detail of a man who had survived everything and was killed in the moment of his victory by something he had already outlasted. The battle did not end Norse presence in Ireland. Norse communities continued in Dublin and other Irish towns for centuries afterward. It did mark the end of the period in which Norse political power could dominate the island. Brian Boru's victory was real. The clean narrative conclusion that his death provided to the story was, as always with history, simpler than what actually followed. The Norse mythological figure of the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain who rode across battlefields selecting which warriors would die and which would live, was not simply a literary decoration. The Valkyries were beings with genuine theological function in the Norse worldview. They were the agents of Odin's will on the battlefield, determining outcomes that appeared to human observers as chance or skill but were in fact the deliberate choices of the god who needed particular warriors for Valhalla's hall. The Norse did not believe that the outcome of battle was random. They believed it was chosen. The warrior who died bravely in battle had been selected, had been found worthy of a specific destination. This belief did not diminish the grief of those who lost the warrior. But it gave the loss a frame that random death could not provide. The Norse mythological system was, among other things, a system for making sense of violence. The Norse legal concept of gri, a temporary peace, a guaranteed safe conduct, was as sacred in Norse law as any other legal bond. A man who violated gri, who killed a person under a guarantee of safety, who attacked someone in a declared peace zone, who broke a sworn truce, was Greininger, a peacebreaker, and his crime placed him outside the protections of the law entirely. The Norse legal system was built on oaths and their binding force. An oath sworn before witnesses was a legal reality. It created obligations that the community recognized and enforced. The gods were invoked as witnesses of oaths, and perjury was therefore not merely a legal violation but a religious one, an offense against the divine witnesses who had been called to observe the swearing. The Norse law was not simply a set of rules. It was a theological system, grounded in the belief that words sworn before the gods created real bonds in the structure of the world. The Norse world did not end. It transformed. The languages descended from Old Norse are still spoken by millions of people across Scandinavia, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. The Althing of Iceland, established around 930 AD, still meets, making it one of the oldest continuously functioning parliamentary institutions in the world. The sagas are still read. The place names are still pronounced. The mythological tradition, preserved by Christian scholars who found it too beautiful to destroy, has fed into the literary and artistic culture of the modern world in ways that are still unfolding. The ships rotted. The longhouses collapsed. The graves were opened and the grave goods removed to museums. But the thing that the Norse world produced, the literature, the legal tradition, the navigational knowledge, the mythological imagination, survived the conversion, survived the centuries, and arrived in the present in forms that are sometimes recognizable and sometimes not, but always present. The railroad is still there. It always has been. There is a waterfall in Iceland called Gofoss, the waterfall of the gods. In the year 1000 AD, a man named Orgeir walked to its edge and threw the carved images of the Norse gods into the water. He had just decided, for an entire nation, that the old world was over and the new one had begun. The images fell into the white water and were gone. But the waterfall kept falling. The water that took the gods that day has long since reached the sea and risen into cloud and fallen as rain and run back to the falls and gone over again, 10,000 times and more. The falls do not remember what they were given. The landscape does not record the decision that was made on its edge. And yet something of what was thrown in was not entirely lost. The myths were written down. The stories were told and retold. The names of the gods were preserved in the days of the week. Thursday is Thor's day, Friday is Freya's day, Wednesday is Odin's day, so that the old religion speaks its names every week in the mouths of people who have forgotten it entirely. The Norse world lasted 3 centuries in its fullest form and left an imprint on the world it touched that has never entirely faded. The straight roads that cut across the English countryside are Roman. But the names of the villages they pass through are Norse. The language in which this history is told, English, carries Latin in its grammar and Norse in its vocabulary and Anglo-Saxon in its bones, and the people who speak it carry in their DNA the genetic record of 1,000 years of mixture and migration that no single national story can contain. The Vikings sailed to the edges of the known world and sometimes beyond them. They built in wood and sailed in wood and were buried in wood, and the wood is mostly gone. What remains is in the ground and in the language and in the myths that a Christian scholar in 13th century Iceland decided were worth writing down, despite everything. Orgeir threw the gods into the waterfall. The waterfall kept falling. Sleep well.